Hello everybody and welcome to this amazing reading of the Dead by Daylight lore for the original 3 killers. In this video we'll be covering the official lore of the 3 killers, Trapper, Hillbilly, and Wraith. During these readings of the lore, keep in mind that there are some discrepancies within the lore itself, and I have not made any corrections to them as to keep the lore just the way it is. With that out of the way, let's begin. Subject 1. Evan McMillan. Trapper. The McMillan estate in all its former glory, now an ominous lot with nothing more than horrid memories of brutality in its purest form. The foundry and mine was the heart and center of the estate. Those unlucky enough to be employed by Archie McMillan slowly started to slip away from all kinds of normal life, wives asking for their husbands to come home. Archie McMillan began to obsess. His life was built around and on top of the mine and foundry. One day, the former workers, now slaves, weren't allowed to leave the premises without permission. Fences and goons made sure of it. Objections were rewarded with a visit to the furnace. Questions and rumors arose in town, but no answers. One less worker, missed by maybe a poor widow, wasn't enough for real actions. Finally, Archie McMillan snapped and sealed his workers in the mine, suffocating them. Archie McMillan's remains was later found, a silent skeleton with a taunting grin upon his meatless skull. What's left of the estate are now but mere ruins and myths. Teens enter the area from time to time in a game of dare, bringing back new information about what's happening at the estate. Because somehow, it seems like something's happening there, even though not really understandable to the simple human eye and mind. Evan McMillan idolized his father. It wasn't just that he was heir to a great fortune, it was the way he ran the estate. Raised under his firm hand, Evan had taken to running the workforce with an iron hand. Production was always high and the McMillan estate prospered under father and son. As Archie McMillan's mental health slowly disintegrated, Evan protected him from the herd who wanted a piece of the fortune. No matter what his father asked of him, Evan would do. When Archie McMillan finally snapped, Evan became his enforcer in what would become known as the worst mass murder in modern history. They never proved that Evan led over 100 men into those dark tunnels before detonating the explosives and sealing them to their fate. The tale of the McMillan estate is a tale of wealth and power gone very wrong. How many victims fell to the hands of father and son is unknown. No record is ever made of what became of Evan McMillan. His father is another unsolved puzzle found in the basement of his own warehouse, dead and abandoned. The beating heart of the mine, the foundry, was where the iron ore was directly smelted into vast ingots. The huge vats still bear evidence of the bodies that were incinerated within them, preserved in the metal residue. The McMillan foundry was consigned to the scrap heap and its horrors forgotten as time passed, and the buildings fell into ruin. The warehouse, once used for storing the coal that fueled the foundry, it now lies abandoned. The roof split wide open, suggesting some titanic explosion, but the angles don't seem to make sense. So to fathom its destiny is not done easily, even if one would want to. Subject 2. Mr. Thompson. Hillbilly. Coldwind Farm was widely known as it spanned 2 countries. Mr. and Mrs. Adams put a lot of work into the farm, but all those blisters and sweat paid off. But for some reason, one day in 1946, produce stopped coming. And when crops started to wither and die, investigators decided to take a closer look. The farmhouse was abandoned. Dust covered the floor. Mold and dampness covered the rest. Fecal matter was found across the house, all but in one room. One room seemed to have been spared from whatever the rest of the house suffered from. It came with no other explanation than that some must live there. But no living soul was to be found. Instead, remains were discovered in the basement, both from Mr. and Mrs. Adams together with livestock. Several years later, as people were trying to renovate and hoped to sell the place, they discovered disturbing things inside the walls as they started to collapse. Things and creations put together by human hands. The whole farm were to be forgotten, but somehow people were drawn to it as things occurred. The silo toppled over during a storm, revealing corpses inside, and one night the harvester started spewing blood across the trees. Now, Coldwind Farm is nothing more than that buzzing sound one can hear during summer nights. The son of wealthy landowners Max and Evelyn Thompson, this unnamed boy was an unwanted child born to savage parents. Hideously disfigured, he was shut away from society, so ashamed that they were their son, so they bricked him into a room and fed him through a hole in the wall. When the boy escaped, he took his revenge savagely and terribly, slaughtering the parents which had tortured him instead of raising him. After the deed was done, he continued to live his life at the farm, taking out his deranged violence on the animals that were allowed to run free. As he finally broke free from his shackles, he ran through the cornfields, chasing and slaughtering whatever he could find. They never found the bodies of Max and Evelyn, but they did find tortured and disemboweled animals all over the farm. Coldwind Farm was quickly settled and the land split up and sold off. There was never a buyer for the farmhouse. Perhaps it was the sound of the chainsaw you could hear throughout those hot summer nights. The farm stood proudly as the centerpiece of the Coldwind Farm for decades. After the horrific events that occurred, the building collapsed into despair and eventual ruin. The farmhouse is nothing more than a forgotten former home where holidays once were celebrated. Once a part of the farm, the slaughterhouse still continued to work for many years after the breakup of the farmland. Rotting stench and stained floor provides proof of all deaths that have taken place here, animal or otherwise. The silo is one of the oldest remaining buildings at Coldwind Farm. A great storm brought the ancient structure crashing down. It was weeks later that searchers discovered 12 bodies buried in the ruins, and no answers were to be found. The cornfield, even before the fall of Coldwind Farm, were surrounded by tales of ominous myths. Everything from mutilated animals to red corn stalks. Now it's abandoned, but still someone seems to care for the corn in some way, as they still stand tall, missing something. Subject 3. Philip Otomo, Wraith. For the common eye, Autohaven Wreckers was nothing more than a scrap heap with old cars. Maybe, to some, an eyesore as people passed it on their way to work. But nobody really knew the secret it kept within. Nobody thought that the police would find hundreds of bodies. Bits and pieces, some more rotten than others, crammed into cars, human bones bent in unnatural ways. The stench that struck the police was unbearable, and the most horrific finding was the owner, stuck in the crusher, without a head. The few employees that could be found held no answers to the deeds that had taken place at the scrapyard. The place was condemned, and as it soiled the town's reputation, people just let it be overgrown, maybe with a naive hope for it to be consumed by nature itself. But as the townsfolk started to see how the lights turned on and off at night, and even could hear the crusher working, they suspected something more. But all they did was to speed up as they passed it on their way to their now somewhat safer lives. Philip Otomo came to this country without anything than hope for a new beginning. He was happy as he got offered a job at the Autohaven Wreckers, a small scrapyard where bribed cops turned a blind eye for a somewhat shady business that took place. Otomo didn't care. He had seen criminal activity up close in his homeland, and as long as he didn't get involved, he let things be. He just fixed cars and handled the crusher, something he did really well. A car went in, a small metallic cube came out. It was not until one gloomy day that he, just by accident, saw some blood coming from one of the uncrushed cars. As he opened the trunk, he found a very young man, gagged and with tied hands, with panic-filled eyes. Otomo freed the man, who managed to run 10 feet before Otomo's boss stopped him and slit his throat. As Otomo demanded answers, he got explained to him that he had been nothing more than a simple executioner, as more or less every car had a soul in them, as this was a service the scrapyard provided to certain clients. Otomo snapped and went ballistic. He threw his boss in the crusher and let it slowly compress as the head stuck out. Otomo grabbed it and pulled head and spine out of the body. Then he left and was never seen again. This old garage was once not just a place of death and execution. Automobiles was actually mended here, amongst oil mixed with blood. But as investigators found out about the atrocities that took place, it became forgotten. The office is where the money changed owners and hands were shook. The heavy-duty safe in the floor might have been a dead giveaway to the shady business that took place. Wads of cash were hidden all over this hellish place, stating that money wasn't an issue. Maybe people got executed for enjoyment rather than wealth. A run-down log cabin at the edge of the scrapyard and home of its owner, the lodge. Weird carvings and etchings in the wall perhaps say more about the owner's state of mind and allude to his disappearance. Reports suggested that prisoners were held in its dark basement before they were taken to the crusher. The junkyard is packed with sharp objects. Walking around the area, aware of the bloodbath that took place here, changes the landscape. Blood-covered metal and bits of flesh. One does not willingly walk amongst all this evidence of death. Thank you all for listening. I hope you learned a great deal about our devious killers. Were they to blame for who they were, or are we to blame only ourselves for who they became? If you enjoyed this video, feel free to check out my other Dead by Daylight lore videos in the description down below. I also participate in guides and gameplay for Dead by Daylight and various other games. Visit the Benedict's Journal reading or Survivors for more lore. New lore videos are still to come regarding the newer chapters, killers, and survivors. Don't forget to share this with all your friends, like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, good game.